Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. This is Suzanne Holteen with the National Conference of State Legislatures. I have a few housekeeping items to go over before we get started. This presentation is available to download during the webinar. It can be accessed via the Media Library, which is the play button in the upper right-hand corner next to the telephone. This webinar will be archived within 1 week. Please go to ncsl.org/webinars to access all webinar archives. And you can ask a question at any time by entering it into the box located on the lower left-hand side of the screen. I am very pleased you all can join us to hear more about this partnership project on occupational licensing, and specifically about the work underway in states to reduce barriers to licensed occupations and improve the portability of licenses across state lines. This project is funded through the U.S. Department of Labor's Employment and Training Administration and is a partnership between NCSL, the National Governors Association Center for Best Practices, and the Council of State Governments. In just a moment, all three organizations will have the opportunity to introduce ourselves. First, I want to quickly run through our agenda for the webinar. Following the organization introductions, I will briefly review some occupational licensing trends NCSL identified during the 2017 legislative session. Following that, you will hear from two representatives from the Learning Consortium states to tell us a little bit more about the work underway in each of their states. And then finally, my colleague Iris Hensey will review some trends we are seeing in the 2018 legislative session and review the resources NCSL and our partners have put together to assist policymakers. We will save time, we will save questions for the end of the webinar, but as you are listening to our presenters, please feel free to type a question in the box located in the lower left-hand corner. For those of you who are not familiar with the National Conference of State Legislatures, we are the professional association for all state legislators and legislative staff in the 50 states and territories. We are a bipartisan organization that provides research, technical assistance, professional development, and opportunities for legislators and staff to exchange ideas. We also advocate on behalf of state legislatures before Congress. NCSL is your resource for information on what is going on in state legislatures, so please don't hesitate to utilize our research and expertise. And now I'm going to turn it over to Megan Wills with NGA, and then she will be followed by Dan Logsdon with CSG.
Thank you so much, Suzanne. Hello, everyone. This is Megan Wills with the National Governors Association Center for Best Practices. Great to talk with all of you today. As Suzanne mentioned earlier, this project is a partnership between NCSL, the NGA Center for Best Practices, and CSG. We're really excited to be part of this project and to be working with so many states on this important work. Just a really quick overview of what and who NGA is, for those of you who may not be familiar. NCSL, as you all know, is the membership association of the state legislators, and the National Governors Association is the membership association of all the nation's governors. We serve as the bipartisan membership association of the governors of the 50 states and the 5 territories. We were founded in 1908, and so we've been around for more than 100 years now, serving governors. We do have a Center for Best Practices, which is the area of NGA where I sit. The Center for Best Practices really serves as kind of the consulting arm of NGA that really supports the nation's governors. We provide a lot of direct technical assistance within states, really helping governors develop solutions to public policy challenges that they're facing, and just really focusing a lot on sharing information across states. So in terms of the licensing project we're working on with NCSL and CSG, the National Governors Association is working with all of the states in the licensing consortium. We are taking the lead role in working with the states of Connecticut, Indiana, and Nevada, but we're playing a supporting role in working with all the states and have really enjoyed digging in on this content and learning more about what's going on in states and working with states. So that's all from me. Suzanne, turning it back over to you. Thanks.
Great. Dan?
Hey, thanks, Suzanne. I apologize in advance for my voice. I got diagnosed with the flu earlier this week, so I'm disputing that. Thanks for joining us today. The Council of State Governments was founded in 1933. It is the nation's only organization serving all 3 branches of government. judicial, executive, and legislative. CSG is a region-based forum that fosters the exchange of insights and ideas to help state officials shape public policy. We offer, we think, unparalleled regional and national and international opportunities to network, develop leaders, collaborate, and create problem-solving partnerships between and among the states. And we're very excited, excuse me, to be a part of this project with the NGA and NCSL. And for everyone's ears, I'll stop right there. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Megan, and thank you, Dan. We are very excited to be working with our partners on this project, Occupational Licensing, Assessing State Policy and Practice. The Occupational Licensing Project was created to help policymakers examine their occupational licensing policies in the states. Jobs that require an occupational license, which is government approval to practice a profession, has grown significantly over the last 60 years, from about 1 in 20 to almost 1 in 4. When implemented properly, occupational licensing can help protect the health and safety of consumers. However, there are many differences and disparities in licensing laws across states that create additional barriers to those looking to enter the workforce and relocate across state lines. The primary objectives of the project are to look at ways states can reduce barriers to the labor market, ensuring licensing requirements are not overly burdensome or restrictive, and improve the portability of occupations across state lines. The project has an additional focus on identifying and addressing current policies that create unnecessary barriers to the labor market for populations with unique challenges, those being people with a criminal history, military families, immigrants with work authorization, and dislocated and long-term unemployed workers. The heart of the 3-year project is the Policy Learning Consortium, which Megan mentioned as well. This peer learning consortium brings together teams from 11 states to learn more about occupational licensing in their own states, as well as best practices from across the country. In the first year of the project, the 11 consortium states have identified goals and actions they wish to accomplish to address the objectives of the project. And a lot of work is already underway in those states, and you will hear from 2 of the consortium states shortly. For those of you who are not aware of the consortium states, I'm happy to list those off. It is Arkansas, Colorado, Connecticut, Delaware, Illinois, Indiana, Kentucky, Maryland, Nevada, Wisconsin, and Utah. Now I want to briefly review some of the legislative trends NCSL has identified in the states during the 2017 legislative session. NCSL identified nearly 400 enacted bills in 47 states that address occupational licenses in some form. This includes bills related to the 4 population groups and the portability of licenses. There are a few areas that we saw some trends and enactments. Many states enacted legislation focused on the portability of licenses, so allowing license holders to move and work across state lines, whether it was in some form of interstate compact or another type of reciprocity agreement. We also saw some states reduce requirements to entry in a profession, whether by the number of hours or credits required or exams needed in order to get a license. Many states focused on reducing barriers for some of the certain population groups that we have identified, such as military veterans and their spouses, as well as individuals with criminal records. And finally, we did see a few states pass legislation to de-license occupations, choosing instead a different form of government regulation. And I put together a few examples here. First, in terms of compact legislation that we saw, Alabama is one example that signed a bill to enter into the Emergency Medical Services Personnel Licensure Interstate Compact. And Delaware passed legislation to enter into the Enhanced Nurse Licensure Compact. Again, those are just 2 examples. We did see multiple states look at compact and enact compact legislation. Arkansas and Texas both enacted bills to create temporary licensure for military veterans and their spouses. The Texas bill was specific to educators, whereas Arkansas was a little bit more generalized in terms of occupations. And then some final examples from 2017 are in regard to reducing education and exam requirements in order to gain licensure. Alaska reduced the requirements for education in order to become a manicurist in the state. And Arizona eliminated the exam requirement when reapplying to be a pharmacy technician in the state. Again, these are just a few examples. Later on in this webinar, my colleague Iris Hensey will show you our legislative tracking database where you can find out more about these bills and others related to occupational licensing. So at this point, I'm going to introduce our first speaker from the Occupational Licensing Consortium. Buddy Johnson is the House parliamentarian in the state of Arkansas and a member of the state's core team on this project, and he's going to tell us a little bit about their work going on.
Thanks, Suzanne. Appreciate everyone being here. When we applied for to be a member state in the consortium last year, we frankly had no idea where this journey would lead, nor did we know where it might end. What we've learned along the way is there's a keen interest in the topic of occupational licensing, and we seem to be on track with the goals we set when we first met as a core team in Tucson. Here's what's happened so far in Arkansas. We returned from Tucson, made it through the holidays, and hit the ground running in January. The core team developed a roster for what became a 25-member home team with stakeholders representing a variety of entities. We called the home team an advisory group, which genuinely seems to be what it is becoming. The advisory group has representatives from secondary, technical, career, and higher education agencies. There are representatives from the State Department of Workforce Services and the State Department of Labor. Quite a few licensing agencies are represented, as are the State Chamber of Commerce and the Arkansas AFL-CIO. We've also had contact with a wide range of other interests whom we eagerly added to a growing email distribution list to receive information and updates about the process. A few weeks later, Governor Asa Hutchinson appointed what he is calling a red tape reduction working group. He charged it with developing recommendations by the end of November so there would be time to write legislation for consideration when the General Assembly convenes in regular session next January. For the sake of simplicity, we'll call this the task force. It is co-chaired by two members of our consortium core team. In support of our initiative, we created a website on which we post articles and reports that might be of interest to the public, the task force, the advisory group, and a host of other interested persons on our email distribution list. Meanwhile, the House of Representatives brought on board a staffer who, among other duties, is tackling the research component of our reform initiative. Dr. Derek Slagle is an assistant professor of public administration at the University of Arkansas at Little Rock. For him, this is much more than an academic exercise, and I feel fortunate to have someone like him as part of our team. At the first regular meeting of the advisory group and of the task force, Dr. Slagle presented his preliminary findings and got the conversation started. We learned a few things afterwards. First, that some licensing entities were pursuing reforms on their own. Second, there may be an interest in immediately bringing in licensing agencies to justify their existence and their licensing processes. Avoiding the latter may be one of our biggest challenges. I fully expect a license-by-license review to happen, eventually, but not immediately. I hope the task force will remain focused on the bigger picture, that being to reform occupational licensing where needed, to remove barriers to employment, address the issue of interstate portability of licenses, and to overcome restrictions that prevent persons with criminal records from being able to go to work. So, what are our next steps to stay on the right track? First, the advisory group is taking charge of identifying any micro reforms that may be taking place within licensing agencies right now. Second, they are asking if any licensing entities feel at risk of being in violation of antitrust laws along the lines of the North Carolina case that went before the U.S. Supreme Court. Third, we are examining what states have done and are doing to eliminate unfair and unneeded occupational barriers faced by persons with criminal records. We'll look at examples from Indiana and Delaware, to name two states. And fourth, we'll examine what licensing agencies are doing to improve the interstate portability of licenses. These are big picture issues that I hope will remain the focus of our task force and advisory group. The time for going after individual licensing entities will come, but I hope it will happen in an informed and methodical way. I also am optimistic that through involvement with this consortium that Arkansas can contribute to a genuine nationwide occupational licensing reform movement. I think we're on the verge of finding out if this is a movement whose time has come. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much, Buddy. Now we are going to hear from Senator Todd Weiler from Utah on their ongoing work in the state. Senator Weiler is leading Utah's team through the consortium.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm Todd Weiler. I've been a state senator for almost 7 years, 6.5 years, 7 sessions. And I've been thrilled to be part of this consortium and really appreciate NCSL taking the lead on this along with CSG and NGA. Even before Utah learned that there was an effort to put together a consortium, we were already kind of working on these issues. And we actually passed some legislation 2 or 3 years ago that created what we call the OPLR Committee. It's Occupational and Professional Licensing Review Committee. And that committee has the obligation to review all of the sunrise and sunset review processes. As many of you are aware, some legislation, especially licensing legislation, will come up every 2 years, 5 years, 10 years for a sunset provision. And then after the committee was up and running for about 2 years, we had some additional legislation in 2017 that expanded the scope of our OPLR committee, again, Occupational and Professional Licensure Review Committee, to require that that all lawful occupations that require a license in the state, so that each licensed lawful occupation is reviewed every 10 years. So we're now engaged in a multi-year process of reviewing every single license. And just to give you an example of that, we had what we call an interim committee meeting last September, and we talked about our private investigator license. And I was surprised to find out that Utah had this, we were tied with one other state for the highest number of hours required to become a licensed private investigator. We had some apprentice statutes. Well, after that review, somebody ran a bill, and this year we cut those numbers of hours in half. And so that's a good example of what we're looking at, and this is a 10-year process where we're going to go through every one. About 6 or 7 years ago, we had, and I know several other states have experienced similar things, we actually had a federal lawsuit about hair braiding because our statute treated hair braiders the same as a licensed cosmetologist. So if someone theoretically moved from Jamaica to Utah, I'm just giving a hypothetical, and wanted to start braiding hair, back at that time, 7 or 8 years ago in Utah, they would have had to have gone to school and for 2,000 hours just to braid hair. And a federal court judge actually overruled that and said, no, that's ridiculous. And so now, as a result of that case, we have an exemption for hair braiders, and we've also brought down the hourly requirement for all cosmetologists substantially. We've cut off, I think, 600 hours or even 800 hours in some situations. And so, and that was the first time that happened right before I joined the legislature. There was a lot of media coverage, and it just kind of made you shake your head, like, why would a hair braider need 2,000 hours of training to braid, somebody's hair? And so, and I think that was a good example for us in Utah that maybe we needed to jumpstart a process to look at what we're doing. And then I wanted to also report on military spouses. We have Hill Air Force Base in Layton, Utah, or Clearfield, Utah. I'm actually sitting in my office about less than a mile from Hill Air Force Base. And so this Air Force Base brings in thousands of military officers. They typically get transferred every 2 to 3 years, and many of them have spouses with licensed careers. So way back in 2011, Representative Tim Cosgrove passed House Bill 384 in Utah that was called Veterans Preference Amendments, and that bill kind of bit off half of the licenses, the ones that are reviewed by our DOPL office is what we call it, which is the Division of Occupational and Professional Licenses, and gave some preferences for military spouses. And then this year, in 2018, I was able to sponsor and pass Senate Bill 227, which tackled the same issue for the rest of the licenses, the ones that were not being regulated just by one of our state agencies, and that included school teachers. And I'll just tell you, I was so pleased that we actually had some school teachers come to the ceremonial bill signing with Governor Gary Herbert 2 weeks ago, and I had a member of the State Board of Education call me, and I was working on this bill with the Salt Lake Chamber of Commerce at the request of the Secretary of the Air Force in a meeting that we had in Washington, D.C. last fall with Congressman Chris Stewart. But I had a state school board member here in Utah call me and say, I'm so glad you're doing this. She said, I just met with over a dozen teachers at Hill Air Force Base. You know, they're all military spouses. They've all taught in other states. Many of them taught in other countries. Some of them have 20 years of experience, and it will take them almost as long to qualify to teach in Utah as they're going to be here. And so with the passage of Senate Bill 227, they can start teaching immediately. And that wasn't just for teachers. It was for literally about 40 different professions. And we did have to look at some areas like there is some federal law for securities, and there were some issues with insurance. So we had to dial back on just those two professions. But for 99% of all of the licensed professions now, a military spouse who is transferred to Utah with their husband or wife, they should be able to start working and making an impact and contributing to their families. And one thing I like to point out for, many of these spouses are married to officers, but for the enlisted personnel, our military pay is so low for many of our enlisted personnel that if they have a family, that they would actually qualify for food stamps and other government assistance based on their family size. So I think it's really important that we make our barriers as low as possible so that the spouses can work and so that they can have that dignity and respect of having a job and being able to support their family on their own. So with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions. I think that this, I'm looking forward to the next 2.5 years remaining on this consortium.
Great. Thank you, Senator Weiler. I'm going to pass it over to Iris Sensi.
All right. Thanks again so much to both Buddy from Arkansas and Senator Weiler from Utah for giving us some great information on what their states are currently working on. Now we're going to turn towards some trends we're seeing so far in 2018. So we've seen legislatures and our consortium states discussing individuals with criminal records, reciprocity, and apprenticeships so far as trends occurring in 2018. When it comes to individuals with criminal records, we're seeing predetermination as one trend so far this year. Predetermination is the practice of allowing offenders to seek information on whether or not a given crime will disqualify them from future licensure in an occupation. A number of states are examining legislation on this topic, including Arizona with Senate Bill 1436, Louisiana with House Bill 372, and Missouri with State Senate Bill 988. We're seeing, in general, a trend towards working with and for the population of individuals with criminal records across states, as lawmakers are considering a variety of other options as well to ease licensing burdens for these folks. In Illinois, Senate Bill 2853 would require the Department of Professional Regulation to make information available on its website on how the department uses criminal history in its decisions on licensure applications, including a list of offenses that would bar licensure completely. This bill is currently being discussed in the state Senate. In Maryland, House Bill 1597 would prohibit departments that issue occupational licenses from denying an application for a license based on an applicant's criminal history if a certain period of time has passed since that conviction, and unless the department makes a determination otherwise that an individual should not be allowed to work in a certain occupation in the future. Reciprocity is another key component in removing unnecessary labor market barriers for workers, and as such is a major focal topic this year for legislatures, as it was in 2017. One example we've seen is Alabama House Bill 388, which passed and provides reciprocity of licenses from other states for military spouses. The Enhanced Nurse Licensure Compact is another example, as both Colorado and New Mexico passed legislation to join the ENLC Compact earlier this year. to ensure nurses moving in and out of their states have less licensing barriers to overcome. In reviewing current occupational licensing policy and practices, states are also focusing on the intersection of workforce development and occupational licensing issues. We've heard from a number of states in our consortium that they're interested in better understanding how occupational licensing laws may be impacting workforce recruitment and retainment in their states. For example, some states are currently examining how licensing processes may be improved to help promote more interest in occupations such as HVAC contractors, electricians, and plumbers. Florida House Bill 711 is an example of a key piece of legislation from this year that aimed to address just such these issues. Finally today, we're going to talk a little bit more about the research and resources that NCSL, NGA, and CSG have put together so far as a part of this project. We have both of our databases, the first being our National Occupational Licensing Database, and the second being our 2017 and 2018 state legislation database. So first, the National Occupational Licensing Database contains over 30,000 data points on how occupations are licensed in all 50 states. The database contains licensing requirement data for all 50 states, and right now covers 31 occupations. Our hope is that it will cover all 34 of our target occupations in the future. However, we have left a few teaching-related occupations out for now, as they are largely regulated at the local level instead of the state level. Each of the occupations to be included in our research had to meet the following criteria. They had to be licensed in at least 30 states. They had to require less than a bachelor's degree in most states. They had to have projected employment growth rate at or higher than the national average, and each occupation must currently have employment levels of at least 10,000 or more. So again, we collected this data at the state level, and we come through state statute to find it all. The dataset provides an in-depth information on the prevalence and level of initial and continuing education requirements, the number and frequency of examinations, the amount of occupational or professional experience or other job training required, and the monetary fees associated with receiving a license. And this is just a quick screenshot of what it looks like. We tried to make it as user-friendly as possible, and not shown here, it also includes an additional page with a glossary that will let you know more information on how we defined each of our variables. And finally, our occupational licensing legislation databases, which are powered by StateNet, contain legislation from all 50 states, covering the same 34 distinct occupations we've been studying throughout the project. We started tracking this legislation in 2017 and will continue this year and beyond into 2019. Our legislation database also contains legislation on occupational licensing laws more generally and includes legislation impacting our 4 target populations that we have identified as being disproportionately impacted by licensure-related barriers to market entry. These populations, again, are skilled immigrants, individuals with criminal records, active duty military veterans and military spouses, and unemployed and dislocated workers. And this is just a quick snapshot of what the legislation database looks like. We're currently in the process of tagging bills for 2018, and as a result, the database is refreshed about once a week. You can pick from any of our topics on the left-hand side of the database and pick any states you'd like to examine further. Then the results will pop up at the bottom of the page. And finally, in addition to our 2 databases, we also have a couple other research deliverables that can be of use to policymakers. So we have our State of Occupational Licensing report, which gives a broad overview of the national occupational licensing landscape as of late last year. We're currently working on reports for each of our 4 target populations. These reports will be an in-depth examination of how occupational licensing and certain licensing requirements can be particularly detrimental to each population. And they'll also include an overview of what states are doing to address these issues. And then you can also go to www.ncsl.org/state-license to see blogs, magazine articles, and other resources from our project. All right, and now I think we'll go to question and answer time.
Great, thank you, Iris. And it looks like there have been a couple questions. First off, and again, you can ask questions in the lower left-hand corner of the screen. But some questions about following the progress of the 11 consortium states. And we plan on putting more information about the 11 states on our webpage. So again, that web link that Iris mentioned, ncsl.org/stateslicense, has all of the information on this 3-year project, but we will be adding additional information specific to the 11 consortium states. And then I also see that in the comments that Buddy has provided the link to Arkansas's occupational licensing project, and we'll be happy to put that up on our webpage as well. And then I also wanted to mention before we get to some of the other questions that it was noted that that we have 30 states now part of the Enhanced Nurse Licensure Compact as of this week. So thank you, Elliot, for that update. And it looks like we have a question for Buddy, if you're still on the line. In your state, what have you found to be the biggest opponents reforming these occupational and licensure laws?
Thanks, Suzanne. That is a good question, I guess, from Jennifer. I would describe it less opposition, but more concern. There's been a general sense that I haven't run into any opposition to reform at this point. I think when we get to the stage where individual licensing entities are under the microscope, then, the opposition might arise. But at this stage, it's more just concern that for a lot of people, the status quo is going to be upended, and, they'll be left out in the cold. So I don't see it now as opposition.
Thank you, Buddy. We're going to jump to another question. There was a question about best practices for sunset provisions. So I'll let Iris answer this.
Hi there. So we are actually currently working on kind of a guide to sunset and sunrise reviews that we'll be publishing, I believe, at the beginning of June. It may be available even sooner on our website. But until then, the Council on Licensure Enforcement and Regulation, CLEAR, they have a great sunset and sunrise review resource on their website. So if you just go to their website and type in sunset and sunrise reviews, you can see it, and they have a 50-state breakdown of what each state is doing in terms of sunset and sunrise laws.
Thank you. Buddy, it looks like we have another question for you in Arkansas. This person would like to hear more about asking entities if they are concerned about being in violation of the SCOTUS NC Dental case.
We're pursuing the answer to that question in some research the person we hired is conducting as part of the research component. We're doing a survey of all the members of the advisory group to begin with, and asking some open-ended questions about what they know about their entity or what they've heard about other entities. And we're just trying to establish a baseline about what might be going on out in the real world. And that's just one of the questions we're asking. And I've heard some chatter about different entities that might have that concern, but we don't have anything concrete. I anticipate us doing a similar survey of all the licensing agencies at some point, but at this stage, the survey is limited to our advisory group.
Great, thank you, Buddy. And it looks like, first off, we had a question about the link to the sunset provisions, and we'll try and look that up here and send that to you, Bethany. There's another question about any studies comparing costs of entry, so time in dollars, versus the earning expectations of the licensee. I I think there are some studies that exist. We don't have them offhand, but we'd be happy to, again, provide you representative with that information. And just on our webpage, ncsl.org/stateslicense, we do have the State of Occupational Licensing report, where I believe we do have links to similar studies. So first thing might be to take a look at that report of ours, but we'd be happy to be in touch with additional information. And then it looks like we have another question. It's a really good question. Are there efforts to differentiate between occupations and professions? And this is something that's come up a lot just among the partners, and as we're contacted by different types of organizations and associations. For the purposes of our project, we have identified occupations as those being that require less than a 4-year degree. When we talk about professional licenses, again, for our purposes, we define those as needing more or needing a 4-year degree and above. I don't know for sure if other states have, or if states or other organizations have gotten as specific in how to identify that, but for the purpose of this project, that's how we've differentiated between occupations versus professions. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to type them in the box. And it looks like we do have the link, and we'll send that right now to CLEAR's information on their sunrise and sunset provisions.
First of all, thanks, Kristen Neville, on an update to us about that Maryland bill. And let's see, is there any intent to separate
So we did have a question about timeline for engaging occupational regulatory agencies. So the 11 states that are part of the consortium, they put together a competitive application process, and many of them identified the regulatory agencies in those states, if they did exist, to be part of the core team or part of their greater stakeholder engagement team. We, among the partner organizations, are encouraging the 11 consortium states to bring in as many stakeholders as possible. So whether that does include regulatory agencies or professional or occupational associations in the states. So there isn't necessarily a specific timeline in terms of engaging them, but as I mentioned, the partners are encouraging all the states to engage with those agencies if they do exist in the states. Do you want to mention FARB? Oh, yes, and one thing that we did not mention with the project is part of the consortium is we've brought together a group of experts in the areas of the 4 different population groups, and then also in occupational licensing in general experts. And so one of our, we do have CLEAR as a member of that expert panel, and we also have FARB as a member of the Federation of Associations of Regulatory Boards. And so this is a really great organization that has associations of different occupations as members. And so we are always encouraging the states to reach out to those associations as well.
Yeah, and there was a question from Priscilla that we got a few minutes ago about the intent to separate different levels of professions or occupations, or will they remain general, as an example, EMTs and paramedics. I think what we found so far, at least with the states that we're working with is that that's kind of a judgment call that they're making as they're going through and reviewing licensure for their target occupations. So I know that I have seen that in one state where they're looking at counseling, and they're looking at like different levels of counseling and different levels of education and different levels of experience, which can get you different designations within that occupation. And so I think that it kind of depends is the answer.
There was a question about is there public health, safety, and welfare component to the consortium's research? And yes, of course. I mean, any occupation that is licensed has it's always best to consider the health and safety of consumers in the occupation, and that's paramount as to why occupational licensing exists. And so, yes, that's always a big component of the discussion and the research. And in our State of Occupational Licensing report that I've already referenced, we spend a lot of time talking about the benefits of occupational licensing and the health and safety needs that these licenses fill in many states.
And there was another question about the timeline of engaging occupational licensing agencies from Whitney. And for most of our state teams, the occupational licensing agencies are playing a very upfront and important role on the teams, and they're working with legislators and they're working with governors' offices to review their practices and see where they can improve their own processes and their own applications and stuff like that, and where they can give input to help policymakers as they go forward with this project. So I would say that as far as the timeline in engaging these agencies, it's completely all the way through the project, through the end of 2019 and hopefully beyond. And then we have a question from Representative Lance Clough about medical community. And let's see, I can't speak specifically to doctors and higher level licensure requirements for sort of higher level health occupations, but one state that we're involved with, Indiana, is looking at some lower level health occupations such as I think CNAs, LPNs, those sorts of occupations. And they're kind of just getting started with their preliminary work, but
I'll add that many of the consortium states are looking at some health occupations. Obviously, a lot of health occupations are licensed, so states have involved, whether it's their departments of health or other agencies as well that do a lot of that licensing.
Yeah, and part of the reason why it's so important to Indiana right now is that it's a big initiative coming from their governor's office. So.
Okay, and then lastly, there was a question about consumer groups involved in this project, and you know, that's a good question. Obviously, consumer groups are sometimes harder to find and just harder in general to involve. Buddy, if you're still there, I know you've involved some consumer groups, or at least a consumer or two on the task force. Isn't that correct?
That is correct.
Yeah, so a lot of states are definitely taking that into consideration. There's nothing necessarily formalized on the project and involving those groups, but it's always an area that's brought up. Well, it appears that those are all of our questions for now. I want to thank everyone for joining us, and then also for the great questions and the information that's also been provided from many states on this chat. We will continue to update our website, ncsl.org/stateslicense, with more information on the project and the consortium states, and then research that the partners are working on. And then finally on this slide are the contacts, emails for myself and Iris, so please feel free to reach out to us with any questions. And with that, we will end. Thank you very much.